Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Impactful Conversations podcast with myself, Dr. Glenn Wallis, and somebody you know very well by now if you've listened to the podcast over the year and a half that we've been doing this, my very, very good friend and co-host, Nejmi Alexander. Hello, so how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Glenn. New pod, new background setting, which I think is becoming a running motif for our episodes. But yeah, no, very, very well, thank you, Glenn. How are you doing?
Good, really good, thank you. Yeah, really good. And it was an unprepared segue, I have to say, but your adaptability, your ability to move into different contexts, whether you're abroad or at different places in the UK, in an office, at home, whatever, is a nice segue into today's conversation, because we're going to talk about something that's really important for leaders in organizations to understand, I think, and to embrace. But also, if you want to future-proof your career, future-proof your performance and your impact, I think one of the things that we're going to talk about is this concept of being adaptable, and when you should stick and when you should twist and when you should pivot and when you should stay on path, and at what points and what is going to inform you about when to make some of those moves, or indeed when not, because there's just so much uncertainty out there, right? And you and I work with senior leaders all the time, and this lack of, well, two things. One is the speed that you're required to respond as a leader seems to have gone up almost exponentially, and is likely in the era of AI, I guess, to move even more quickly. So you've got the speed challenge, and you've also got the uncertainty that both contributes to, but there is also uncertainty that stands apart from pace, if that makes sense. So I think it's a tricky environment, I think.
Without doubt, there's, it's unsurprising to say that there's a lot of pace of change, right? Like that's not it's not groundbreaking or new for anyone that's awake or alive in modern day. Um, and with that, I think there is um, a distinct need for adaptability within leadership, within ambitious professionals, because there's change happening afoot in sort of every direction that you look, right? Like as leaders, you're required to you know suss out new models, new ways of working, new roles, even for some of your team. Of course, new tools, and adopting different you know processes, and really thinking through like how to drive all of those aspects, how to drive change effectively within your team, within your organization, within yourself, which I think is a really important point, and we'll explore that in a bit more detail. And how to drive all of that at what feels like, to me, feels like an increasing pace. I think we certainly felt that over the past year and a half or 2 years. And so within that context, of course, the latency at which one can adapt becomes even more important. And there are, I think, for me, adaptability is a really interesting idea because, like creativity, I feel like it's something that happens in the absence of other things being present. Um, and what I mean by that is, so we say sort of necessity is the mother of invention, right? Like when there's an absolute need, and we feel it really acutely, then we adapt. That as humans, I think everybody has that capacity. But when it doesn't feel when it feels like there's choice, or that it's not absolute necessity to adapt and to adapt quickly, then consciously or subconsciously, there can be things that affect the speed at which we do that, right? Our fears sometimes can come into play, and resist we can resist having to do the new or the uncertain thing. And other ideas around like identities and sort of labels that we can place on ourselves. There are these, and stories and values, there are these ideas that can keep us in status quo,
Yeah.
um and can prevent us sometimes from adapting quickly. And when that's the case, those things need to be worked on, right? Like that's the stuff that helps us to adapt
Yeah.
quicker.
So you've talked about adaptability that is a sort of outwardly focused, so it might be adapting to a changing context. There's also some internal change that might be going on. You've sort of recognized some traits or some beliefs maybe that or values that you hold that are now no longer fit for purpose, or they're not as optimized as they might be. So I think that's a really important first point to land here, which is when we talk about adaptability, it's not just adaptation that is, an external way of being, but it's also or a way of operating. There's also sort of something a bit more internal around the identity and some of those deeper elements
Yeah.
that you hold. I think that's a really important first part. And the second part, which I really loved, I haven't thought about it in the way that you described it, which is, there are lots of kind of is it not aphorisms, but lots of sayings like, if it ain't fit, if it's not broken, don't try and fix it, and there are loads of those, and they often compete with each other. So one will be advising you to sort of stick with it and stay firm and whatever, and then other things that will say change, a change as good as a rest, right? So there's all sorts of advice, which I think is quite deep seated in our psyche, to your point, which means that we are adaptable as human beings. But do we adapt proactively or enough or sufficiently effective to be effective, versus it's actually mostly reactive adapting? That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about how leaders battle with that.
Yeah. I think that's the opportunity, right? The front foot proactive adaptation that requires us to choose. We need to do the work in order to be able to do that effectively. And so, prioritizing, placing your attention towards that as a, as a muscle, as a skill, um, or as a capability, maybe even as an identity factor. Um, that's where I think the opportunity really lay. If we accept that, you know, pace of change is only increasing, and the requirement for leaders and ambitious professionals is to do that really well, to adapt really well. And so yeah, so I think like that's and that I think that this idea around future proofing, I think, is a really interesting place to explore, because how do you do that, when we're like running at 100% to try and keep the lights on or keep status quo, and then we know that there's this sort of requirement to be looking at the new and adapting our own internal landscape, as well as for our teams, and adopting like new ways forward. That I think is really interesting, because again, you need to make that choice to prioritize this. And so how you do that in amongst all of that, I think, is really an interesting
Yeah.
topic to explore.
And it wasn't that long ago. I was talking to a leader who was sort of bemoaning AI, not because not because they were a technophobe in any way, but it's just something else to have to put your attention on to get yourself up to speed. And I think the point that that you and I were talking about just before we went live to record it was, it's genuinely difficult for leaders to make space and time with all of the pressures that they face, whether you're a very senior leader, maybe on the C-suite, or somebody in the organization who's leading a functional team or part of a functional team. To be able to go, actually, I'm going to take half a day out a month or half a day out every couple of weeks to scan outside of our organization, see what's happening, invest some time in learning about that, and then how that's going to impact my leadership and whether I need to adapt as a result of some of those things, is not easy. But I honestly think it's a great practice. And I'm not saying the half a day is the right amount of time, by the way, but
Yeah.
it's so easy, isn't it, to get, we both coach leaders, I know, that are so focused on their organization, their team, this deliverable, that they miss the important stuff that's going on around them.
Yeah. It is difficult, but I would argue that it's such a high leverage thing to focus on, that difficult though it may be, it's critical for one's own success. And what I mean by that is, I often work with leaders around this idea of career agility.
All right, say a bit more
And
about
it's
that.
something that I care about quite a lot. Well, um so in an uncertain world, in an uncertain, and it's always uncertain, right? Like no one can forecast the future. If I could, that'd be a lot better. But this is, that is always the context for everything. But it feels like it becomes more opaque and more, uncertain, when we know that, business models are changing, and tech redundancies over the past, couple of years have kind of shifted the landscape, or the trust in, what has typically always been like growth, and all of these sort of external factors that really shake, I think, the again, sometimes the trust that leaders have in their own, positions in, as they look forward in a year or two, or the macroeconomic context, or whatever it might be. And so when the future seems even less certain than typical, what I work with leaders around is to think about, well, what is within your control, and what can you take ownership for within your own career, and ensure that you are future proofed, right? Like actually being agile in your career, in terms of, you know, one of the first bits of work that we do is like identifying labels that we associate ourselves with. So a challenge that I often like to present to people is like, how do you introduce yourself without talking about your job title, without introducing like I'm X at Y? It's very difficult because we associate our identity to, I am this role, and therefore that's, a proxy for anybody to understand my identity. And so helping people to work through understanding the labels that they associate with themselves, and moving past that, actually looking at, well, what are the strengths, what are the stories, what are the values that you bring into your leadership and into your career, and helping to define that so that you can see move past like identities and labels in that respect, and actually look at where your where are those stories and those attributes, where could that be applicable if you were to look, like laterally, or like looking at different functions, or different sectors, or anything like that. Not necessarily is it always around a job change, but actually it's about helping people to understand their value proposition, in a way that is distinct from like a linear path that maybe doesn't feel like the next step is the right step, or if the next step is even going to be in, you know in the not too distant future, or any of those, fearful ideas that can come to the fore. So
Mm,
working with leaders to help them to understand, firstly, their career story, and understand where they could be making, pivots towards, and how to do that, and also helping people to look at their own, once you've got clarity around that, is to look at your own learning navigation, like actually determining and being on the front foot around where do you want to adapt the skills and the stories that you can tell, and or talk to, and being proactive around that, whether that means, looking for project opportunities within the organization, or looking for like different ways in which you can stretch, and learn and develop and build more into your, again, skill set, or into your story, that helps you to be able to, pivot in directions that you want to, and in response to things that are adapting as the future unfolds.
yeah, I think there's well, there's so much in there, and maybe we'll set aside another podcast actually to look at that work that you do in more detail. So I think there's so much there, so much of a sort of rich vein for leaders to take, even from just the couple of minutes you've shared there, because without doing that consciously, and without doing that, semi-regularly, that sort of review and reflection, I think it's very difficult to know how you're meant to adapt, and then adapt, in the. I don't think there's any guarantee that you'll ever do it properly 100% of the time. But what's the most effective pivot or adaptation you might make at this point, based on what you found through those kind of exercises? Incredibly powerful for people. I would just, before we move on to just some other elements of this, I want to bring that other. You've talked there very much about the internal development of the leader, and I think that's, and how they can adapt, and linked it to the external. I just want to be very overt in some of that external work too, which is, it is difficult to find time to learn and to make yourself aware of what's going on in the broader system in which you're leading, and that is about, reading a paper, on a semi-regular basis, reading trade journals, going to conferences, all things which actually I absolutely get are a time suck, and sort of when you're under the cosh for a delivery, feel like maybe a bit of a distraction. They're honestly not, because what you should be doing is taking some of that more transactional information in, thinking about what does that mean for our business, might it mean for our customers, and how am I going to adapt my approach accordingly. Is not the same kind of change that you're working with senior leaders on, but it's still important in my view, because it's about, how that's the strategic work of leadership, right? It's understanding the context in which you're working.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think often people can deprioritize this thinking because it feels like selfish. And there's a gap there.
Yeah.
Yes, sometimes it can feel like selfish in the classic sense, but you know, people are more oriented on like their stakeholders, their team, or like external focus. And so your own, yourself within that can come come down in the pecking order.
Yeah.
But actually, I'd encourage you to acknowledge that self leadership and self career management is a function of your leadership. It's a critical part of it. It's not different. You need to be able to manage all of that 360 focus. Really, I know it's classic. You need to manage it all. But
Good
no,
luck.
but my point is, it needs to sit higher in the pecking order for most.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, if you're not determining your own strategy for success, then you'll always just be playing to somebody else's. And in true leadership, it's really important that you're determining your own.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. And the old adage about, what got you here won't get you there, because the context has changed, is really important. And if you're not doing that personal work and the more external information gathering work and then reflecting on that, I think you're gonna be behind. That it's a nice link, I think, to, we're talking about leaders adapting in the context of, the space that they're having to lead in, and that of course includes, the evolution of the whole AI piece. And you might say, well, one of the easiest things to do, of course, is to set up an AI agent on one of the large language models and get them to summarize, or, everything that's going on in my space and get a weekly update. Yeah, kind of fine. And if that's all that you've got, then you're leveraging AI for your own benefit, and then to inform how you might adapt. It's probably not as effective as, taking time out and doing the deep thinking. And I think this brings us on to one of the other challenges with the current context, particularly AI, is the fast thinking trap that I've definitely fallen into in the last 18 months. And I'll put my hand up and say the first, I've been the first to do that. I love tech. I love exploring it. I love trying to understand it. And um, I have given away some of my own thinking agency to AI tools as I explore them. There is no doubt about that. If I look back at how I'm operating now to how I operated even 12 months ago, it's significantly different. Um, and the danger is that I'm not just giving up my thinking skills, if you like, to some extent, and outsourcing them to AI. I'm also not developing my thinking skills in the context of an AI world. Does that make sense? So I'm sort of, as I say, I'm kind of outsourcing it to this freelancer called ChatGPT or Claude. And I think speed, Kahneman talks about fast thinking and slow thinking. And I think the danger is that we all get caught up doing fast thinking, and we're not taking enough time to do some of that deep work, and get exhausted as a result, and poorer results as a result of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's tempting, right? We talk
Yeah.
about pain and availability of knowledge, and AI doing some of the thinking as well, to, leveraging that knowledge. It the temptation, of course, is there to do that, to fall into that fast thinking fast trap. How do we combat that? What can we do to create spaces to think slowly? And what's the payoff?
I think the payoff is massive, if you can and do make the time to do that. And again, this is not me bashing, the AI tools, I genuinely think they're absolutely incredible, but they're not a replacement for, because they're basically pattern matchers, right? At the moment, it's largely, I'll give you an answer based on, patterns that I recognize from previous examples. That's not the same as an experienced leader, or indeed just an experienced human being, looking at a very complex situation and bringing novel thinking to it. You're not going to get novel thinking at the moment very much from AI. It might be novel to you, but that's not the same as it being novel thinking for the situation in which you're working. And so I think there's a we've talked a lot on this podcast, and other very well-known speakers and thinkers in the leadership space have talked about time to think, creating spaciousness, and all of those important ideas. If you don't create some of that space, I think the danger is, and you will not be adapting to the AI era. You'll be sucked into it, and before you know it, you've given up all sense of agency, and you're not bringing your unique skills and value to the conversation. So I think the upside is absolutely massive. We talk about future-proofing yourself. Well, continue to prove value, I think, is the best way of doing that.
Do you know what this makes me think of? I think I've had this thought loosely before, but it's just certainly come to the fore right now, and it's kind of become clearer. I think it's advantageous for every individual leader, to have their own set of ground rules around how they use AI. For that, I mean, what is the kind of thinking that you're happy and willing to outsource? Getting to that level of thinking, like, it's useful for analysis. So if I want to make a decision, I'm happy to use AI to like scan the thing and maybe make some recommendations, but ultimately I'm going to make the decision, and it'll be great. I'll bring my own, experience and context into it or whatever, versus, okay, well, let's go ahead with the recommendation, do the next step, just continue to, how ChatGPT always gives you like, should I do this next thing? And just you looking, following it until you get to some outcome. Of course, that works if you kind of have a sense of what it is you want to arrive to. If you're doing totally new thinking or learning, then that's those are different contexts, right? And actually, if you're doing learning, then AI is not the best. It's useful for insight gathering, but not for helping you to learn, because actually there's studies, there's very little data that is out there. It's emerging, but there are studies that demonstrate that AI use has dramatically decreased learning like capability in some university students. I can't remember the exact study or the numbers around it, but it's clear, and it's not unsurprising, right? Like, if you are to outsource some of your thinking, that you're not building that muscle, and sometimes that can waste, right, if you're not using it as effectively as most things in the body can. So actually determining your own sort of manifesto around the type of thinking that you want help support with, that the AI tools are useful for, and the kind of thinking that just requires more slow paced, more reflection. Like, what are you willing to commit to maintain that like capacity and the upside of it?
Yeah, and some of that, and I'd certainly speak from my experience of coaching leaders, is that the way to liberate some of that time, and there's at least two approaches that come to mind, having coached this topic around with leaders a lot over the last 26 years. One is the ability to delegate a task to the right level of the person in your team. So actually constantly scanning, are you involved in work that you shouldn't be doing at the level that you're leading? I think that's really a really important part. And secondly, what could you stop that's not going to have any material negative impact on you, the team, the business? Because again, I think we've spoken often about businesses being very good at starting initiatives, but terrible at stopping them or pausing them. And I think if you did those two things alone on a semi-regular basis, you'd be surprised how much time leaders can liberate. And then don't just let the time, everything else fill up to the space that you've now created, but actually, to your point, make some priorities about what you want to learn, make some priorities about what you're going to go and do some research on. Really importantly, make some time to think about the decisions that maybe you haven't got enough and you're never going to have enough information on, and not outsource that to AI's best guess, but let's start with your best guess of, from everything with all the complexity, what's your best predicted way forward based on your experiences and being a clever human being. I think there's at least two things that most leaders can do periodically that will liberate enough time to improve the quality of thinking. And the danger is if you don't, I think it is like a muscle. And I think the danger is I would say that the quality of my thinking in the last 12 months, has gone down quite significantly. And I'm only now beginning to genuinely wrestle back time. I've cancelled, I've taken, I've taken all social media apps off my phone and off my iPad. And the time back from that alone, is time that I can do improved thinking on.
Yeah. It's crafting out time to do your mental workouts, like
Yeah.
actually like creating the space to think slow is just, it's using that skill, and there's benefit of what comes out of it, right? Like then you can apply that thinking to adapt,
Yeah.
creating space to be adaptable.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's really key. And I'm not saying it's easy, but I think there are at least, giving you a couple of approaches that most leaders listening to this would be well advised to go away and just try a couple of those things, to be honest, and see how much time you can liberate. The other thing I just wanted to share in relation to this adaptability topic, because again, I've coached a number of leaders, I would say in the last 18 months, who aren't sure whether to carry on with something or to pivot. And I think there is at least a couple of traps that leaders can fall into, that if we think about it in the context of adapting, that we want to just flag. And one is the sunk cost fallacy, which is the idea that you've backed a particular horse, or in this case backed a particular decision, and you're going to carry on throwing resources at it because, well, I've already given tens of thousands of pounds to this decision, or millions of pounds in some of the billions of pounds potentially in some of the big things, so therefore I can't pull out of that decision, and I keep investing in it. And the danger is that 3 years down the line, what you realize is it was never the right decision, and you'd have been better off pulling that resource early on. And I think the tension is that, and being aware of that, with perseverance and the idea of stickability and driving on. And is that something you've had experience of, either personally or in the coaching work that you do for leaders, and helping them wrestle with that balance, that sort of tension between those two things?
Yeah, it's a really interesting space or question, right? Like how much effort or how much commitment is too much, or
Yeah.
when's the right time to pull away or to change a decision. And actually, whenever I come across this with coaching clients, my approach, I kind of borrows from sort of previous, I don't know, history, education, and economics,
Right.
because it is an economic concept, right?
Yeah.
Sunk cost
Yeah.
fallacy. And when that's the case, we do a bit of work to size up the actual costs and the tangible costs and the intangible
Right.
costs.
All right.
And what I mean by that is, I don't know, time or money, that's going into, like, from this point onwards, what's it going to take you to get to wherever you needed to be,
Yeah.
size that. But then also opportunity cost, like what are you losing by going after this thing,
Yeah.
sizing up all of the costs, and then looking at the potential upside. So if this decision goes well, what's the point, like what's the benefit, and can you put a weight to that? Like, it doesn't have to be like, you don't have to arrive at a number at the end of this sort of thinking or exercise, but a feeling, like a true judgment around all sides of it. So we weigh up the potential upside and the potential like downside. If it doesn't come off, again, what's the additional cost now that you need to bear? Maybe you need to think through, like, how are you going to get to where you want to get to, or like, all of the effort, time, energy, or whatever that comes into arriving at that outside, at the other side. And just weighing it all up, like once you get it all out on the table or in your mind, your mind's table, to then do that equation, actually what makes sense. Does it make sense to go forward from here and potentially realize all of these costs because the upside is so significant and I really want
Right.
thing? Or actually, when I look at it on balance, it just is clear that this is not the right decision. We're just gonna, it's just, now's the right time to make there's no better time than now. If it's not the right decision, there's no better time than now to make the decision. So once we arrive at that, then we can quickly turn into, okay, well, what are your alternatives? What's the other way forward? And start to do some of that thinking to shift
Yeah.
from stuck or stick to what are the twist options.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
that's the
think,
thing.
yeah, I think I love that, and I do think it takes that level of kind of conscious planning, reviewing of things. I think you can, because that's slow thinking about a decision, right? And I think that's really important. I think it'd be easy to make a gut decision and take a heuristic kind of approach and go, well, my sense is we've done this before. It's not worth continuing with. You think, well, actually, you only needed one more week of investment, and you'd have made it. I think the other thing I would just add to the method that you just approached is a little word of warning, I guess, for leaders, which is when you're doing the exercise that Nejmi's just so brilliantly outlined, park your ego. And that's really hard, right? Because you're tied to a decision. Your reputation might, be to some extent tarnished if you make the wrong choice about stick or twist. But I think you need to park the ego when you're making the final decision on that, because failing to do so means that all the data might be telling you one thing, but your own sense of self-image or reputation or whatever, suggests that you either don't make a decision or make the wrong decision off the back of that. Easier said than done, often easier done with a third party. So somebody that can challenge you on whether you're really suffering from some confirmation bias, or holding on to a decision that you should let go of.
Yeah, it's similar thinking. You mentioned, when to stay and when to pivot, um, and it's kind of similar thinking with regards to, experimentation. If we come back to this idea of like being adaptable, sometimes in or often in leadership, it requires us to, take a punt on, new ways forward, new ways of working, new tools, new processes, new strategies, new products, whatever it might be. And when that's the case, again, the question of like how much energy or how much resource is right to throw into testing this and to proving it. And uh, when it comes to that sort of, one of the things that I've sort of worked with clients with over the years is trying to build in like industrialized experimentation underneath the kind of concept of growth,
Yeah.
um, to build in like experimentation as a way of operating, and so like setting up proof of concepts or minimum viable products or processes. Like what's the least that we could do in order to just test the idea, and what's the least proof point that we would need to give us a sense that this idea could work or it's worth continuing.
Yeah.
And just setting up really sort of light experiments that give you a data point, a proof point, or some other things to explore, like going through, working through assumptions, because it might be that actually we've got 10 assumptions that need to be true in order for us to go after this thing again, new product or new tool, making sense to plow into resources into way forward. And so creating all of your, taking a bit of a scientific approach, creating all of your assumptions, listing them all out in a very discrete level of detail, and then just setting up experiments proof points against each of those. Like, what do we need? What's the least that we need to know in order to be confident that this is worth continuing with, and taking that approach sort of holistically in when it comes to this idea of adapting, because it's like a safer way to and a leaner way to make innovation or adaptation a way in which you operate.
Yeah.
So that's something else that came to mind.
And of course, actually, those sort of maybe a couple of weeks sprints or a month sprint, depending on the complexity of the experiment that you try, actually train you to be adaptable, because to some extent you're then looking at the material, the data at the end of that 2 weeks or a month or whatever it is, and then you're having to adapt based on what the data's showing you. So there's a kind of nice sort of macro level theme back to our topic of today, which is it kind of trains you to be more adaptable, but in short, bite-sized, low-risk environment or lower risk environment, which is really cool. Look, this has been a really really interesting topic, and I don't use this word very often in relation to the work that you and I do, but I genuinely have a lot of sympathy for leaders, because I think it's a difficult space to be in at the moment. And I hope what we've done through this episode is to offer leaders some crumb of comfort, B, some approaches that you might take to help make adapting a little bit more part of the way that you just lead, but also help you future-proof your space inside organizations by doing adaptability and doing adaptation really well, because that the environment requires it of you. And I think not sticking your head in the sand is definitely not going to get you very far along the career approach. And we'll definitely come back to trying to understand that work that you do a lot more, Nejmi, I think, in a separate podcast, because it felt, as you were talking about, it felt viscerally really important, that it's the sort of thing that leaders might really benefit from.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to that conversation, and I've really enjoyed this one as always. So hopefully we've got some useful ideas to go ahead and put into practice, and work on those adaptability muscles.
Yeah, excellent. Good stuff. Until the next time. See you soon.
Take care. Bye.